Are you all set? More or less?
More or less.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody, folks in the room and at home, to the 2020 fall technical series presentation. My name is Joseph Hendricks. I teach an English program. I am the organizer and host of the series. So I will introduce the speakers as we go, and special thank you to our marketing team who have made it possible to live stream this and record it and design the logo and gotten the word out and done all the designing for the marketing. So we appreciate your work. So every spring semester, the faculty brainstorm a theme or a topic that we will present on in the fall. So this year is not only an election year, and it's a pretty colorful election year, I think it's safe to say, but it is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing women the right to vote. It is one of many important steps, and there is still plenty of important work that we all still have to do today. So that's the theme that we went with. So all the presentations will circle somewhere around kind of voting the 19th Amendment. I am super pleased to introduce our first presenter, Keesha Burke-Henderson. She is our Director of Diversity and International Student Success. Keesha has brought some amazing individuals and events to campus. She is also critical in supporting our international students and in helping inform the rest of us how we can better support our international students. The title of her presentation tonight is Am I a Woman? Black Women at the Intersections of Suffrage, Citizenship, and Democracy. Afterwards, there will be there'll be time for a few questions for those of you in the room if you have any. Otherwise, Keesha, thank you so much for being here. And
thank you.
Take it away.
First, I want to say it's my honor and pleasure to be speaking today at the opening of our annual Mount Mercy faculty series. Thank you to Joe and Mary and all of the others that are on the organizing committee. Mount Mercy has faculty and staff that extend themselves beyond our walls or beyond the titles here and bring their work to challenge and hopefully change our society as well, and definitely have an impact on our students here in other ways outside of the classroom. So again, thank you for just inviting me today. As you can see, we are all covered, and I've got this weird space thing on my face, and welcome to 2020 with things as they are. So this will be nice as a historical record of what happens in 2020. So before we even get started, and I get into my title, I just wanted to take a moment and just give a moment of thought, reflection, and silence, if you will, or at least reflection. And I'm asking that you reflect in your mind as well as in your heart about some of the people that have impacted you in your world, particularly women, if you can think about them, and put that in your heart space and think about what they left for you or what they have given you. And so we want to do this in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was not only a force to be reckoned with, if you will, but also a controversial figure. And we can, do a whole series, I think, on Ruth and her work and what she meant and what she symbolized. But most of all, if we could just take a moment and just reflect. So we just, we take that moment, we remember people, we want to say thank you. And whether you agree with them or not, Ruth Bader was a woman that persevered. Her presence was transformational. Her work was, if controversial, certainly pushed the boundaries. And she changed the narrative that we have in America right now. And so, we just want to make sure that we are working in the nuances, which is what I always say, right? You don't have to be on one side or another of any particular position, and I think we get lost in that. We get lost in the dualities, right? The either-ors, right? The dichotomies. And we forget about the intricacies, and we forget about the things that are complicated, and how things coexist, and also the nuance and the details and the context, right? And the ambiguities. Those are the beauties it's the beauty of politics, right? It is the beauty of social justice work, if you are considering social justice work. It is the beauty of life, right? There's no clear anything, and we like to get presented with stories and narratives that somehow have this really clear linear path to them, and that's not the truth, right? The truth is that we are all experiencing our lives in very different ways, which means that the complexity of each individual is really what's important, and we're all dealing with different things as well. And so this is kind of why, if I can go back to my title, Am I a Woman? And the Black women at the intersections of suffrage, democracy, and citizenship. And as you know, suffrage is the fight for votes, the fight to be represented in government, right? And then we talk about citizenship and what citizenship really means. And some people think that it's black and white. It's not. Right? Citizenship has meant a whole lot of things, especially here in the United States, where citizenship has been very complicated throughout history. Who gets to be a citizen is a question that we're still struggling with today, right? Who gets to be a citizen? Who becomes a citizen, and how do they become a citizen? And then, of course, you talk about democracy as representation and having a voice as a citizen, right? And in this sort of very utopian view of democracy that is. And again, democracy is a very complicated term, right? Democracy is not a simple term to deal with. Democracy has its moral implications as well as its implications in terms of how it's enacted in government and what that really means, right? We can talk about representative government as being democratic. We can talk about people representing you in government. And we can talk about so many things that as it relates when we talk about creating a democracy and how that is continually contested and shifted and shaped and formed. So again, even today, we are working with what definition of democracy are we talking about, right? So again, these things are very complicated. So the title of my speech came from a speech delivered by Sojourner Truth, and I'm going to get to her a little bit later. But there's this controversy about her speech, Ain't I a Woman? And part of the controversy is that it was written in a Southern voice and had a dialect to it that was broken in terms of like what you would consider to be broken English, broken Black English. However, there has been some controversy too around the fact that Sojourner she was not from the South, she was actually from New York, and so therefore would have probably spoken in more of a Dutch accent versus a Southern accent. And so the title is contested because Ain't I a Woman is very Southern, And so it probably was not so, and it's probably more, leaning towards, am I a woman? So just work with me a little bit as you travel with me in my mind. As I prefaced this, I rarely ever think in the linear or in dualities, right? It's just sort of not the way that I think as a Caribbean woman. As a Caribbean woman, someone who is trained in the nuance, trained in the gray areas. It's the way that I think. The way that I think is a little bit more circular. I've always had trouble in my traditional classes because of the very linear ways that we're taught, and we're taught to give back information. So I always have found it in the classroom that I had to find my own way to learn, and then definitely my own way to teach back. And so if you can work with me as I go through my own sort of circular thinking and anti-linearity. So I'm starting here with suffrage, and I know that you all are used to hearing the history of suffrage, right? And it starts very much with the Seneca Falls Convention, and you hear of the Susan B. Anthony's and all of the players that had to do with the suffrage movement. And there's a very key view or look of what that looks like. So today I'm going to liberate the black women out of the view of the white woman, right? So I'm going to liberate the black woman so that she is not necessarily framed in terms of what the white women were doing, and just what black women do and have done, all right? So here I start with Stacey Abrams. And through my slides, you'll notice that I put their born dates. And I put their born dates for significance. Because what we tend to think is that a lot of our social movements, which suffrage was a social movement, it was a social/political movement. We tend to think that they were so long ago, and that somehow that there is a space between where we are and them, what happened then. But actually, there's a continuation, right? And there are no gaps. There's just continuation, and it's a part of a timeline. And so these women, when they were born, is really significant to me, because it also tells you about what influenced their minds from the past, and then where we are in terms of our timeline and moving forward. So Stacey Abrams is actually pretty young in considering all things. So Stacey Abrams, for those of you who are not familiar, she ran for governor in Georgia. And she was the first black woman to do so. And actually she won 75% of the votes in Georgia. 75% of the Democratic vote, in Georgia, which is unprecedented, right? It just hasn't happened before. Not only that, but when she was running with Brian Kemp, who ran on the Republican side, it was nearly 50-50, right? So she was actually 55,000 votes short of winning the election. And actually there was controversy, and they had to recount the votes. And every vote had to be counted. And Brian Kemp was Secretary of State while the elections were going on. And so if you know anything about elections, the Secretary of State, essentially, they monitor elections, or they are, and running at the same time that he was overseeing the elections. Also, to put it into context, we're talking about a very deep South state. This is a deep Southern state. And so there's a lot of tensions there. And Republicans rule in terms of Georgia. So the reason why this is important is because, first of all, Abrams never conceded to Kemp. She never conceded. She essentially just kind of dropped out of the race. That's how she sort of left it, because she would not concede, because there was so many issues with the voting. They were not counting mail-in ballots, and so they had to go back and recount mail-in ballots. So when we talk about suffrage, right, and the right to vote, and who gets to vote, and whose vote gets counted, understand that these issues are still part of our society, our culture. Then you add to that what you'll hear some of the suffragists, the black suffragists said in the past, the double cross of being black and then being female in America. It's called the double cross, right? And now, of course, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw has forwarded this idea into intersectionality, right? Where you consider, you know, the multiple oppressions that people endure in society. So you're talking about a black woman running in a deep southern state against a white Republican that they have been entrenched in that government for a long period of time. And then you're talking about, of course, the actual politics of how they monitor the elections. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. What came out of this is that Stacey Abrams, after the election, then formed this organization called Fair Fight. And you can see here, the Fair Fight is about promoting fair elections in Georgia and around the country, encourage voter participation in elections, and educate voters about elections and their voting rights. Fair Fight brings awareness to the public on election reform, advocates for election reform at all levels, and engages in other voter education programs and communications. Right, so Fair Fight, you can look up that information on fairfight.org. But right now, that's what her job is that she is advocating for voter rights and for people to be able to vote properly in elections. And the greatest thing that I love about Stacey Abrams, I studied communication. And part of that study is looking at representation and identity and how people are represented in the media and how people represent themselves as a factor of their identity. And if you look at Stacey Abrams here, she's not your typical, what you consider your typical look for, you know, someone who's engaged in politics. So I know for a lot of you, it may not come across, but she's dark-skinned, right? She wears her hair natural in terms of a natural, you know, black woman's state of natural. She is, in terms of her body type, she is definitely robust in her body type. And, you know, everything about her is what you consider that sort of, you know, look of what, you know, people expect you to be. So besides her look, then she has all of these credentials that just far exceeds so many of the people on the playing field around her. And then she's not shy about her skills. She's been a businesswoman. She has opened multiple businesses, and, you know, she's come from very modest background. She has always sort of excelled in school, but had to do so from that modest background. It's not like she had necessarily that high middle class family and others that have gone on to college, that went to college before her. So, you know, when we talk about modern suffrage and we talk about black women at the intersections of democracy and citizenship and what this looks like, she's definitely a model for where we are and where we're going, right? Because we still have to fight. And if I can back up even a little bit, we have to remember that suffrage was not complete because they rolled back 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave protections to people in states, right? So remember that when we're talking about the 19th Amendment, which is a federal mandate. It is not a state one, right? And so states were actually given the rights first to enact laws that govern the way that they vote. And then, of course, the federal government came in and they mandated who could vote and who's considered, basically it's citizenship and who has a voice in the government. So, oh no, my picture is not there. All right, well, and the picture is so important to this. The next person that I'm going to talk about is Florence Kennedy. And her picture is so crucial that I'm probably going to have to Google it so I can show it to you. Because again, when we talk about symbolic, we talk about people who have symbolic representations. And I'll just leave it here. Right? This is Florence Kennedy. And if you follow me here, we look at Stacey Abrams, who is not necessarily your average, looking person in terms of politics, but besides all of that, she is a powerhouse. When we talk about Florence Kennedy and her politics, Florence Kennedy, I learned about her through the young lady that wrote a book about her. Her name is Cherie Randolph. She's a professor at Georgia, and when I went to her lecture, she talked about Florence Kennedy in a way that I felt like I knew her, and she felt so contemporary. So if I go back here, you see that Florence Kennedy was actually born in 1916. Why is this significant? Well, remember that when we look at the 19th Amendment, it was signed when? In 1920. And Florence Kennedy was born in 1916. She was 4 years old when the right to vote was given, right? And so she was the co-founder of the National Organization for Women. She is lesser known and lesser spoken about, but yet she was just an absolute phenom. She was the first black woman to graduate from Columbia Law School, and she did not do so easily. They literally told her that she could not attend, even though her grades were higher than all of the men that they admitted to the law school. Her grades, on average, was higher than all of the white men that were admitted, some of them having C's and D's, and her grades were A's and B's, and they did not admit her. And so she had to fight and contest it, and eventually she won and she got in. She was going to sue them. And so she won. So she was the first woman to graduate from black woman to graduate from Columbia Law School. She was deeply critical of white feminists. And not only was she deeply critical, but she worked alongside them at the same time. And so you'll see a lot of pictures of her with Gloria Steinem, because they actually went on the speaking circuit together. Gloria Steinem has said that going after Florence Kennedy was not something that she ever wanted to do, so she spoke first because she was such a firecracker. She was of no convention, meaning that she just usurped everything that you thought about a woman in terms of graces should be, right? She cursed. She talked about sexuality freely. She essentially was completely liberated from any notions of what they considered to be oppressive titles on her. She just refused to hang on to any of that. She also started, and what's significant about her for me is that she started the Feminist Party. And the Feminist Party nominated Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm for president in 1972. And that's my next person. So Shirley was born in 1924, 4 years after the Voting Rights for women, the 19th Amendment, right? So Shirley was from Barbados. Well, she wasn't, her parents were from Barbados, but she grew up in New York. She used to go back, she was sent back to Barbados in her childhood. And, you know, she ran for president under the Democratic Party in 1972, being nominated by the Feminist Party. And so you're talking about really radical stuff that's going on right now. So here you have a black woman who's running for president. Unheard of, right? Just not something that you do. While she was also the first black woman in Congress. And she's just pretty much a phenom in terms of politics. She's actually one of the people that made me interested in studying gender and politics and leadership, because she had a very significant leadership style. If you look at her record in Congress and look at some of the things that they noted about her, one of the things that they noted was that she was not a team player. So one of the slogans that she used was unbought and unbossed, right? And it was true. So, you know, other Congress people would tell her to play nice in her committees, and she essentially refused. And so they would move her because she just would not play their games. And she continued to push for the issues that she thought was important, which was education. She was a huge proponent of education. She was against the Vietnam War, and so she would not sign any bills that supported, you know, military action or anything like that. She was just completely off the cuff when it came to what other people had in mind. She was also responsible for getting land grants, and, you know, for African Americans. And so she was a proponent for that. So Chisholm's welcome in the House was not warm due to her immediate outspokenness. She said, "I have no intention of just sitting quietly and observing," she said. "I intend to focus attention on the nation's problems." And so, you know, not only the nation's problems, but also, you know, the problems that she felt was at home. So she saw things in a very broad scope. And, you know, she looked at not only the communities of African Americans, but also what was happening in the world. And she felt like she needed to take a stand and make a difference. So when we talk about diversity of thought, right? When you include someone that is not entrenched in the system and comes from outside of the system, and they bring those ideas inside of the system so that it can change or transform it, right? And you get that pushback, you get the tension. That's what is necessary for change to happen. All right, so this is a big player right here. And how this connected is so many ways. Obviously, you see here that Angela Davis is born in 1944. Angela Davis is not necessarily a politician, but when we talk about being at the intersections of democracy, citizenship, and suffrage, right? People who are fighting for voting rights, who are fighting for the rights of people, she's a black woman who is continually, to this day, relentlessly at the forefront of political issues and social issues in our country. So Angela Davis has given us so much. And if I can turn you to some of the pages in her book, Race, Class, and Gender. And I'm just gonna fall back here because she talks a lot about women's suffrage. And she talks about the time there were tensions between white suffragists and black suffragists, right? And how that all went down. And if you haven't read about it or watched a video on it, then I do suggest that you do that. I didn't want to really focus on that so much today. There's a lot of information about those tensions. Just know that the lines cut really deep because the 14th Amendment allowed for black men to vote, and it did not allow for women to vote. And of course, it wasn't until the 19th Amendment where women were able to vote. So you have to think about what that means, especially for black women, because black men were given the right to vote, but of course, the 19th women were not allowed to vote. And then when women were given the right to vote, you still had state laws that kept black people away from the polls, right? Because we're talking about periods when they would give them poll taxes, right? When you had to take a test of some sort to vote, right? All of these things were taking place at the polls to keep black people away from the vote. So you have to remember how black women were on the margins this entire time. And so the suffragist movement, this is when you talk about feminisms and what they really look like. And this is a huge demarcating part of, white suffragist and white feminism, black suffragists and black feminism. And there's so many things that's included in that in terms of the politics and the issues that envelop white suffragists and black suffragists. And one of the distinctive features, I would say, is that black suffragists always had the interest of the black family, right, and of the community in terms of working class and labor class people in mind, always. It was always inside of their agenda. So it actually was more far-reaching than their communities. Whereas white suffragists simply wanted, I shouldn't say simply, that's not a good word, but they wanted representation and wanted to be able to speak up for themselves. There's a lot of nuance in there too, because within the white suffragist movement, you had, also dividing lines with those that were part of the Christian movement, who, wanted to be able to, speak for themselves and their homes and their children and what that should look like. And then you had other women who had really more political, visions for themselves and how far that they wanted to go, right? So there's a lot of nuance there as well. So the 19th Amendment reads that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's what it says. The 14th Amendment reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, right? So if you all are interested, really deep dig into this because it's so much fun, right? Because this language leaves so much room for anything else to take place. It does not say, hey, it's written in the negative. It's not written in the positive. It is written in the negative, meaning that there's so much room there for anything else to take place. So just because you don't deny me, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by the state on account of sex, does not mean that you can't deny me based on something else. Right, which means education, which means class, which means economic status. There's so many other ways that you can deny someone. So, when we get to Angela Davis and her criticisms are based on race, class, and gender, right? It's an intersection of how so many competing forces can keep someone down. But she goes deeply into the suffrage movement, and she talks deeply about, the tensions between white women and black women, and also how white women literally kept black women out of the movement. And again, I didn't want to go too far down in the rabbit hole, but I did want to highlight Angela Davis thinking about the suffrage movement and what she says. And so here she says, whether the criticism of the 14th and 15th Amendments expressed by the leaders of the women's rights movements was justifiable or not is still being debated. But one thing seems clear, their defense of their own interest as white middle-class women in a frequently egotistical and elitist fashion exposed the tenuous and superficial nature of their relationship to the post-war campaign of black equality. So, and then she criticizes Stanton and Anthony. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony interpreted the Union victory as the real emancipation of the millions of black people who had been the victims of the Southern slaveocracy. They assumed that the abolition of the slave system elevated black people to a position in U.S. society that was comparable in almost every respect to that of middle-class white women. That's some very flawed thinking. And so here's a quote by one of the women. By the act of the Emancipation and the Civil Rights Bill, the Negro and woman now had the same civil and political status alike, needing only the ballot. So as you can see, there's a lot of issues there. But you know, again, Angela Davis brought these to the fore. Please check out the race, class, and gender. In her section here on working women, black women, and the history of the suffrage movement, she said women were welcomed at the 1869 founding convention of the National Colored Labor Union. As the black workers explained in one resolution, they did not want to commit the mistakes heretofore made by our white fellow citizens in omitting women. So, and then lastly, she says, woman was the test. But not every woman seemed to qualify. Black women, of course, were virtually invisible within the protracted campaign for women's suffrage. As for white working class women, the suffrage leaders were probably impressed at first by the organizing efforts and militancy of their working class sisters, but as it turned out, the working women themselves did not enthusiastically embrace the cause of women's suffrage. Although Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton persuaded several female labor leaders to protest the disenfranchisement of women, the masses of working women were far too concerned about their immediate problems, wages, hours, working conditions, to fight for a cause that seemed terribly abstract. According to Susan B. Anthony, the great distinctive advantage possessed by the working men of this republic is that the son of the humblest citizen, black or white, has equal chances with the son of the richest in the land. Again, you see some flawed thinking, and Angela Davis really sort of breaks down these ideas in race, class, and gender. Angela Davis herself was a communist at first. She has since now, of course, because of the flaws in communism, is no longer, but it's really important when we talk about democracy and the fact that you're here in America and you can declare a different political ideal and how to subscribe to that. So Davis was also she continues today to be someone who is very outspoken about social issues. She, at one point, you know, was a part of the Black Panther political party, and it was a political party. And so that's really important to understand, too, that there was politics and very strategic politics involved. And then today, with the Black Lives Matter movement, she's very central, and her voice is very central in that movement. So again, here you see that there is still a suffrage movement that is happening. Hopefully that didn't lock me out. It did. All right, so Ida B. Who doesn't love an Ida B? Well, Ida B. Wells is significant, and I connected her back to the, connected her in the way from Angela Davis, because Angela Davis is very critical in writing about the suffrage movement. And Ida B. Wells was right smack dab in the middle of some of those controversies that Angela was talking about. So if you, let me paint a picture for you. So you have the white suffragists who, there's a long history there, right? The white suffragists at some point during their, in the movement, became aligned with slave-supporting politicians. And that narrative of the slave-supporting, they became aligned with not only slave-supporting, because that was the thing to do back then, right? But not only that, it was with a white nationalist groups. Back then, they were not afraid to say that America for white people, right? That's what was on the slogans. That was one of the signs. And, you know, very much Stanton and Anthony, though they were originally abolitionists, eventually for the political cause, got themselves aligned with some of these money folks in the South to help support their campaign for the right to vote. So their view and their eyes were on the prize in terms of getting the right to vote. And this is why they aligned themselves with some of those you know, characters that not only were slave supporting, but also white nationalist. America is for white people, period. And that black people did not have and should not have any citizenship rights at all. So given that, you know, that tension, then you come around with someone with like an Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells wrote about the lynchings that was happening around the country. She was a journalist, and her work was centered at looking, she wrote an entire document that documented the lynchings that happened over a course of a year, I think it was. And just pretty dynamic work. You know, she was educated and an educator. So Ida B. Wells is a phenom. So Ida is part of this organization, and black women and white women did not organize the same, right? Which is also part of the tension. Black women organized in churches. They had groups that were maybe social club that also had political ideas. And they were not only interested in the right to vote, they were interested in other economic issues, other economic and social issues. One of those issues, of course, was you know, sexual rights, I'm sorry, not sexual rights, but, you know, essentially a lot of black women were being raped, right, because of working domestic work. So they would work in, you know, white homes, they would get raped. And so that was one of the concerns of black women. It was not the concern of white women, right? And so, you know, again, you have a different set of concerns. Ida B. was concerned about the lynchings that was happening to black men. Then you had the the black women that were being abused and raped in homes that were not their own, right? In addition to that, then you had the labor rights that they were looking for black women who happened to be mostly domestic workers. So the issues, again, were very different than they were for white women. And white suffragists were only concerned at the time about earning the vote and not necessarily tied with those other issues. And so they kind of separated because they said, well, you have other things on your agenda. This is not on our agenda. So that's where you see this split. And part of the organization, so Ida B. was one of the first people, I'm sorry, she was also part of the a meeting that they had to organize, and so they, when organizing their march, that the black women would march in the back. And so Ida said, oh no, we're not having that, right? Either we march with you or, you know, or nothing at all. And so what they did is that they came up with this plan that they would march according to their interests or with some of their social groups. So what they did was that they created groups of like students, of like laborers, and, you know, domestic workers and so on and so forth. And they created these groups that ended up being mixed. And that's how that march went on. But Ida was known for, you know, for cutting the crap, right? So she's one of my personal heroes again, and someone that, you know, deserves her due. And if you notice too, in the pictures that I've used, I try to depict the women in the fullness of who they are, not just their headshots. Because I think that's so important, again, for, you know, when we talk about the symbolic, right? You always see headshots of people, and there's like, it almost cuts them off. But if you see them in the fullness and the wholeness of who they are, you really kind of get a different picture, because body language says a lot, right? Body language means something. And so here, Chisholm looks very firm, and not only firm, but she looks approachable. And, you know, there's something to be said about that. I failed to mention who this lady next to her was, and that was Gwendolyn Sawyer. She was the first black woman law student to attend the University of Miami. And she was elected state representative, becoming the first black woman to serve as legislator for the state of Florida. So again, here you see that there's some very powerful people, and they actually created, they were some of the initial members of the Minority Affairs Committee and the National Black Caucus, right? So then we move on to Anna Julia Cooper, who was born in 1858. What's distinctive about most of the women that I'm talking about, and the black women in the suffrage movement as well as beyond, is that they're educated. That is significant, because they then become representative for other people who were not. So essentially, their education was an act of radicalism. It was not for selfish pursuit. Their education became something that they used for the representation of groups of people. And that in itself is political, right? That in itself is the very definition of what we call democracy, right? The freedom to think, and the freedom, and not only the freedom to think, but to be a citizen that could then give back to society in a conscious and in a moral way, and of course, you know, with critical thinking skills involved. And so, but then there's the flip side of that, which is that they also had a sense of, or they were part of the elite, right? So they were not your ordinary person. Anna Julia Cooper was criticized, actually, for being part of this elite, and was even pushed out of one of her positions because she was teaching the students like Latin and Greek and the arts, and sort of these elite ways of thinking versus, you know, just sort of labor-ready subjects, if you will. So it's sort of the split between Du Bois and, you know, going in that direction. And I know that I'm saying a lot of names, but W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about the talented tenth among black people, would sort of save the race. So Anna Julia Cooper was an educator, a scholar. She helped facilitate the opening of the first YWCA chapter, which again, you know, you think about YWCA, you don't think about the politics of the YWCA, but it's an organizing faction in women. And so, especially back in the day, the YWCA and YMCA represented more than just a good place to go and work out, right? They were places where people organized and got together. So she was very much a part of that. She played a leadership role in the Washington Colored Women's League, which eventually became a part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And the National Association of Colored Women is this broad-reaching organization that was in, I don't know if it was in every state, but it certainly reached the states where you had a good amount of black people who were educated. And this is where they organized. This is where they came together and talked about what are some of the political objectives that they had, and what are some of the social objectives that they had, and how they wanted to push and move forward. So Anna Julia Cooper, you know, is also known for her writing about the race and about women's issues and how they were situated at the time. So she, as someone during this time, 1850, well, she's born in 1858, but her work is in the mid-1900s here, and you start to notice that, wow, she's really ahead of her time in terms of her thinking. And again, when we talk about using the buzzwords of intersectionality, Julia Cooper was on it already, right? She was talking about intersectionality from the beginning. And she states that right position of women in the state is another index of civilization. Poverty and industry with a healthy mind read very easily the laws of humanity and love them, and love, then, and I'm sorry, I can't see with this thing, places the sexes in right relations of mutual respect, and a severe morality gives the essential charm to women, which educates all that is delicate, poetic, and self-sacrificing, breeds courtesy and learning, conversation and wit in her rough mate, so that I have thought it a sufficient definition of civilization to say it is the influence of good woman. So she again is another powerhouse. And then we get to Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth has this legend that we talk about. She spoke at the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. She used to sell she used to sell this photograph of herself. This is the photograph right here. And it said, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." So the shadow, of course, being the picture, the substance being her, and the support of her. She is an abolitionist, and she was part of the National Freedmen's Relief Association. There's a picture of her and Abraham Lincoln together somewhere if you take a look at that. But what she was most famous for was this speech that I will close with today, and then kind of give you my closing remarks. I know I told you a lot, and I've been talking a lot for the past hour, and hopefully it was useful to you. So the speech is entitled, "Ain't I a Woman?" And it's delivered at the 1851 Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. "Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But that's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? And then a member of the audience whispers, "Intellect." That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much as rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman? Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say. So, again, that was, they said that's what she said. But again, it's written in the voice of the Southern, and it's still disputed. And I continue to dispute it in such a way that, you know, when we're looking right now and we're asking the question about who gets to represent whom, right? And we are in the middle of social tensions that have to do with race. And we think about, you know, the fact that does it matter if someone is a woman or not, in terms of their ability to lead and their ability to make decisions that are beyond the borders of a home, right? The question is, there is no question. Am I a woman? Yes. Does that make me any less? Absolutely not. And as we can see from the race that happened with Hillary Clinton, where there's a lot of debate too about that's going around about how white women voted. And white women tended to vote more towards Trump, and not only Trump, but there's a history of that, where they vote more towards white men. Even in instances where it's not a national election, you will hear that and see that because of the symbolic representation of what leadership looks like. Leadership looks like and has been embodied in white men in this country. It is part of our collective implicit bias that leadership looks like a white dude, right? And that representation is in limited bodies. But representation and who gives voice to your issues are the people that are concerned about your issues. That's what democracy is all about. Who's concerned about your issues and who can represent you best as you are citizens of anywhere that you are. And so as we consider this and we come full circle back, we started with Stacy, and now we're back at Kamala after our little trip here. And Kamala is running for, well, she's not running, but she's running alongside Joe Biden. And she is the first black woman to do this. And just consider the road that has been traveled thus far. And I know I didn't talk a lot about the struggles necessarily, because I didn't really want to focus on that. I really wanted to make this almost sort of my own love letter to all of those women, and you know what they did and how they did it and how they organized and what they spoke of. And I hope I was able to get that across. These are some of the women from the National Association of Colored Women. And this picture, I think it was taken, if I'm not mistaken, about 1916 or something like that. And women still organize. You go to your churches, the church basements, right now on Zoom on Sundays, when they get off of church meetings on Sunday and they meet, they're talking about their issues. They're talking about things that have to do with their families. They're talking about how to better our communities. They're talking about the education that we're receiving. And they're talking about it not just for black children, but for everyone. And there's a saying that says when a black woman enters into the room or enters into politics, she's bringing everybody with her. She's I forgot who said it, one of the politicians, she's the moral compass of our politics. And so with that, I say thank you for having me.
We have time if anyone has a couple questions. If anyone in the room has
Don't be shy. I guess nothing complicated you, huh? Go, Jasmine, yes. Huh?
How did you choose the women?
How did the Jews?
You discover them.
How did I discover the women?
Yes.
Not hard. So if you Google black women in suffrage, no, seriously, there's literally like 5 women who were critical and pivotal in the black women's suffrage movement, at least who they talk about. But all of those other women, because I am studying black women in political leadership and trying to kind of look at how black women lead in general, some of the ways that I connected those people, because they're not naturally connected, as you can see, but they jive together for me because of their activism. And so I discovered, I shouldn't say discovered, I have encountered these women along the way in very different ways. So Stacey Abrams, I actually met her when I was in Georgia. We had a conversation about my dissertation work. And so I met her even before she had any desires, or I don't know if she had desires at the time, but she certainly wasn't running at the time. She was still running one of her businesses, and she was, you know, doing some local campaigning for other people. And so through a conversation with her and just kind of getting to know her and then seeing her kind of raise up through the political ranks and to who she is right now, of course, she's just one of my own, right now, personal heroes, even though she's younger than me. So I just think she's incredible, and definitely she fits right in the pocket when we talk about suffrage and the continual fight for voting and representation among people. So she's right in the pocket doing that right now as a black woman suffragist. That's why I wanted to start with her. And then, of course, you get to all of the other people that were influential in my thinking. So there's black feminist thought, right, and black feminist political thought. And Angela Davis is at the center of black feminist political thought. You can't have black feminist political thought and leave out Angela Davis or, you know, someone like a Patricia Hill Collins. But it just so happens that Angela has sort of centered herself in the middle of the political fights and has been doing so, as you can see, since like the late 1950s all the way up till now. So she's been really central in that. And then, of course, Ida B. Wells, we grow up with Ida B. Wells in this country, thinking about her as young people. She's one of those one black persons that we all learn about in school, you know, is Ida B. as the, you know, the educator and the activist and the suffragist. So again, that's how, you know, I came to her. And then Sojourner Truth, you know, her story is just actually so remarkable because there's so much more to her than even I was able to tell. She was not, in terms of what we would consider literate, so she's actually out of the canon of what I was talking about in terms of people being elite and literate. She was not, and she dictated her life to someone, and they wrote a book about her while she was alive and told her story about being a slave in the North, which is not common to hear about that story. So each of them has definitely had their significance. And when I was in grad school and I was looking at black women in leadership, then Shirley Chisholm just shot through me. Like, you know, when you talk about representation and being able to see yourself in someone, Shirley Chisholm was definitely it for me, right? Coming from the Caribbean and really trying to put your politics in a space that makes sense and not being, not compromising on what you believe in and how you're going to do things. She was just so inspirational to me in grad school, and this was in my business program. So they really did not understand why I was situating Shirley Chisholm into my work. But to me, she exemplified leadership, right? And when we talk about leadership, oftentimes you don't see women, right? And you certainly don't see black women. You don't see women of color. You don't see women who represent international, right? Sort of this kind of symbolic sense about them. You don't see that. When you open up a leadership book, well, who was I reading about? I was reading about Jack Welch, right? You know, I'm reading about, what's his name that owned Virgin? what is his name? The owned Virgin. Richard Branson, right? Like, these are the people that we were reading in terms of leadership. And I'm like, well, where are the black women at? So I was searching, and then there goes Shirley Chisholm, and then trying to understand that politics. And of course, that led me, as I'm studying black women in leadership, that led me to Florence Kennedy, who when I saw her, I was like, ooh, we should all be so liberated and free, right? And she's like the very definition of what it means to be liberated. So that's my journey through all of those women. There's definitely something personal in all of them, but still tying back to this whole issue of suffrage, of citizenship, of democracy, because that's what they did. That was their life. It wasn't separate from who they were. It was their life. Any more questions? No? All right, well, thank you all for hanging with me. It was really great. And I hope that I left you with a little bit of something that you can, if not take away exactly from this lecture, certainly more information that you can research on your own and a place to start digging in. So thank you.
Thanks, Keisha. And thanks for coming. Good night, everybody.